much for being here today. It's my honor to really be here to talk about Loud and Clear for the very first time in Indonesia, and it's also really nice to meet all of you in person. So as introduced, I'm Cozy, the head of music for Southeast Asia at Spotify. If we can go to the next slide. Next slide. Oh, sorry. The first slide. Wow. Yeah. So I think before I start, we're talking about how we're here to speak about Loud and Clear for the first time in Indonesia. But I wanted to explain what Loud and Clear really is. So Loud and Clear is actually an annual report that Spotify publishes annually to give clarity around music streaming and its economics. So what it serves to do is also to give artists, industry, and fans insights into some of the data that we're seeing around the wider global industry. And it also serves as a very valuable resource because we want to create transparency around some of the important conversations around royalty system, its process, and we'll talk about it a little bit as well. So today we're also going to be sharing some very exciting key takeaways for Indonesia specifically, and that's around most of its key growth of the industry and artists as well. So with that, I actually first want to set the stage, but before I dive in, I wanted to set the stage on how, next slide, we're actually in the era of streaming opportunities. So what I mean by this, if you look at the music industry in the last 10-15 years, it's actually transformed a lot. And even when we launched in Indonesia in 2016, and I was very lucky to have been part of that crew, we've actually seen the music industry change a lot as well. So when we look at, say in the past, the music industry was actually dominated by a few global superstars, and we all know this. But what the streaming era has brought is that it has actually lowered the barrier of entry and really leveled the playing field. So artists now has more access than ever to create, to also distribute, and then to amplify their music. And Spotify is a big facilitator of that. So we just look at the kind of tools that we are building for artists. If you go into Spotify for Artists, for example, artists can now pitch for their music, to a global network of editors. They can also have access to audience data, so they can understand where audiences are coming from. They can also take control of their profile, curate their pages in the way that they want to present themselves to fans. What they can also do is to list concerts if they are touring. They can also sell merch, and more recently, they are also able to upload visual components that actually helps deepen the storytelling around the music. So things like clips, canvas, and also music video, which we are actually beta testing in Indonesia. So this actually empowers artists to drive a lot more discovery around who they are to fans. And if you look at IFPI report that was released, the latest IFPI report actually has shown that streaming revenue is now majority of the global music revenue. And that says a lot. It's at 67% right now, and we expect that to continue to increase. And if you look at that data, we're also seeing that more and more artists are now able to find success and also build careers on Spotify. Now, if you look at Spotify as a company, we're now at 615 million users across 184 markets. And that actually brings a lot of opportunities. It basically open up the whole world for an artist to actually be discovered by new audiences as well. And that's very, very exciting for us. Now, the very exciting and also important topic of how the money flows. So a lot of times artists actually, they ask, we are seeing in the news that, music industry is at hyper growth, is at all-time high, but where does the money go to, and how does it go back to the pockets of artists and songwriters? I want to start by first explaining how Spotify actually generates revenue. So we generate them through paid subscriptions and also advertising revenue on the free tier. And then Spotify actually pays out about 2/3 of the revenue that we generate back to the industry. And it's also important to note that Spotify does not pay artists and songwriters directly. We actually pay them through rights holders. So who are these rights holders, you may ask? They are your record labels, your independent distributors, your publishers, your collecting societies, performing right organization. So Spotify actually pays 2/3 of those revenues back to these rights holders, and then it goes back to the artists and songwriters. And artists and songwriters these days, they are quite spoiled for choice. they actually have the freedom to choose which rights holder they want to distribute their music to, and also these rights holder will then actually collect royalties on their behalf. And year over year, Spotify has actually paid out more and more royalties back to these rights holders, which is going back to artists and the industry as well. So if you look at our global report, next slide, Spotify actually had a record payout last year. So for another year, we've actually set the record for the highest annual payment to the music industry from a single retailer, and that sits at $9 billion. And this figure has actually tripled over the past 6 years. And if you look at what we paid out since we were founded, which is in 2006, this is actually a big chunk of the 48 billion that we paid out to the industry to date. And if you look at the Indonesia statistics, next slide. So we are also seeing the same trend. So in 2023, royalties that's generated from Indonesian artists from Spotify alone was close to triple since 2021. And since 2017, the revenue that Spotify has paid to the industry has actually increased 1,500%, which is a lot. Next slide. So with that, I also kind of want to dive into some of the key takeaways from the loud and clear data for Indonesia. And this few takeaways I'll talk through one by one. It actually goes to show the growth of the local music industry as well as artists and the role that Spotify has played in that journey. And I wanted to first start by talking about something that's very close to my heart, which is discovery. Next slide. So the first data that we want to share with you is that today more and more artists are being discovered on Spotify than ever before. So if you look at last year alone, Indonesian artists were discovered over 5.1 billion times by first-time listeners on Spotify. So what this means, right, if I can break it down, is that more and more listeners are discovering artists for the first time. And this is also because music consumption has diversified a lot. So more and more artists are actually making up majority of the consumption on Spotify. So in the past, there might be a few artists that's making up the majority number of streams on Spotify, but now that number has tripled in the last few years. So it means that more and more artists are given the opportunity to be discovered. And at Spotify, we actually drive discovery in a few ways. So one of the things that we are doing, and we have been investing a lot in, is the personalized listening experience. So we actually use algorithms to actually drive discovery at scale. And I'm sure if you're using Spotify, you have experienced that. Your Discover Weekly, your daylist, and then your daily mixes like radio. These are different things that we're doing to drive discovery through algorithm. And then of course, there's editorial playlists as well, which I'll talk to a little bit more later. And this basically is helping more artists get access to a global audience because our reach is global. And if I can give a very good example, Hindia, who's here today and who will join me later, his top markets are not just in Indonesia. He's got listeners in Singapore, in Philippines, in Malaysia, US, Japan. So basically what Spotify has done is provided the accessibility to the music to actually drive discovery for Indonesian artists anywhere across the world and find new audiences as well. So as I mentioned, outside of personalization, which is a big part of how we drive discovery, playlists are also something that we are curating to help drive discovery for Indonesian music. So if you can click one more time to show the stats, yeah. So on Spotify, if you actually open the app, you'll see that there's a plethora of different kinds of playlists. There's genres, there's moods and moments playlists, there's playlists for catalog, there's playlists for new artists, there's playlists for different regions of Indonesian music. So what happens is that editors are actually curating and reflecting what's happening on ground. They have so they rely on data and insights to actually look at what's trending in the market, what kind of insights are we getting, and then elevating the listening experience for the user every single day. So their job really is to bring the right music to the right audience at the right time. And if you look at last year alone, over 3,600 Indonesian artists were actually added into editorial playlists on Spotify. So this is helping drive a lot of discovery as well. And at Spotify, when we launch in a market, we want to make sure that we are locally relevant. So we look at how we're curating, it's actually super localized. And we now have playlists that's representing your Javanese music. We also have playlists representing East Indonesia, Sumatra, and all these different regions because more and more artists are putting out music these days. So not only are we going local and hyper-local, we are also able to use the global connection to actually move music across borders very seamlessly. Which brings me to my next point about how, next slide, more Indonesian artists are actually reaching borderless success. And this is a big part of our DNA as well. We really want to see artists reach audiences anywhere across the world. So if we look at last year, more than 2/3 of all royalties generated by Indonesian artists on Spotify were from outside of Indonesia. So that's very exciting because earlier I mentioned how we're lowering the barriers of entry, more artists are actually being able to put out music, and they're also able to amplify that music across borders. So if you look at a very good example I wanted to share is Pamukas. So, when we were supporting him since day one, but when he had a viral moment with the track To The Bone, we actually amplified it across the region. And then at that time, his top market, and still is, one of his top markets outside of Indonesia is actually Philippines, and also Singapore. And what was the best part is that he started touring in Southeast Asia as well. So, that has really opened up doors for a lot of artists. And more recently, another indie trio from Surabaya called The Malos. If you haven't checked it out, please do. They were actually picked up and widely supported globally. So when their new single was released, it was actually programmed on New Music Friday in the US. And also added into many different indie and chill places. And with that, their top market is actually now in the US, which is really amazing. So we're actually helping drive discovery for a lot of the artists outside of Indonesia. And if you look at, if you take a step back and see how music has been exporting, if you look at a decade ago, it was primarily happening between US and UK. Like we were importing a lot of the music and export was coming from there. But as the world started becoming more connected, Spotify also launched in more markets. We're now seeing that there are music that's exporting from this part of the world, artists that's exporting from this part of the world, and it's actually created a very, very beautiful kaleidoscope of music exchange across the world, and that's something that we're driving every day. So not just some of the artists that I mentioned, yes, they have English tracks, but that's not necessarily in terms of crossing over. If you look at artists who perform in Bahasa Indonesia, they have also collectively seen their Spotify revenue grow 501% since 2018. So when you look at where Bahasa Indonesian artists, like Indonesian artists are being consumed, we're also seeing that in Malaysia and Singapore, which is close by, the consumption for Indonesian content has also grown. And you see Mahanini, you see Anggi Marito, they are all always on the top 50 charts as well. So you're seeing that that's also contributing to the royalties that these artists are making on Spotify. And then if we look back home, so I spoke a bit about export and how Indonesian artists are finding new audiences. I also want to talk about how they are performing in Indonesia itself. So if we look at 2023, Indonesian artists are actually dominating the charts on Spotify. So they are responsible for close to 60% of the tracks that were featured on Indonesia's daily top 50. So if you look at local content consumption, it's actually at an all-time high on Spotify right now for Indonesia. And Indo-pop is one of the biggest genres on Spotify in Indonesia as well. So you can see that the audiences are really loving and supporting their local talents. And it's very exciting for the local music scene also. And if you look at the charts, right, it's also not dominated by just a specific genre. I mentioned Indo-pop, but it's actually quite diverse. So you see like pop tracks, indie tracks, Javanese tracks, like last year Guyon Waton also made it onto the top 50. And then you're also seeing not just established artists, which used to be the case when we first launched, there's a lot more emerging artists that are topping the charts as well. So like Bernadia, I think she had 4 tracks in top 50 last year, and she was a radar artist. And I'll explain a little bit what radar is. Radar is actually our global emerging artist program. So Spotify really want to champion the next generation of superstar because they are the future of the music industry. So we want to continue giving them opportunities to be showcased. And just last year, one of our radar artists Nadif Baslama, he actually broke the record for staying on #1 on the top 50 charts for 6 months straight. And that's really, really, really very exciting for young artists that are aspiring and coming out. So they are also given equal opportunities to be discovered, consumed, and loved in Indonesia as well.